My pleasure. I wanted to participate in the previous one. I just gave a class on all those problems and pruning and coddling moths, so I put some things in the links, so forgive me for butting in a little bit. But yeah, we have a lot of orchard up here in Boundary County, which is where I'm from. But I will stick to my topic here on backyard poultry production because I've got a lot to cover and I want to leave time for slides. Okay, so why do we keep backyard chickens? It's very rewarding. They produce wonderful eggs, bright orange yolks, full of vitamin A, high quality protein from your own backyard. It's very useful. They're great at recycling food scraps and leftovers. They generate rich manure for your garden. They will till your garden for you, whether or not you want them to. We let them at some times of year, eating bugs and plants. They're just fun animals to watch, and it's an enjoyable hobby for sure. You can surely see the difference between the egg that was grown in your own backyard with plenty of sunshine and a great rich diet, and the one from the store that looks very old and sad. Very nice to have your own eggs for baking and eating. But we're going to go through some of the pluses and minuses today. Reasons you may not want to keep chickens. First of all, you have to see if it's legal to do in your own backyard. I know that ordinances have been changing to allow or not allow a certain number. Roosters in particular can be annoying in town. If you have good relationships with your neighbors, perhaps you can give them eggs and keep them happy. You will need to care for them on a regular basis. In the wintertime, water availability is a little tricky. You may have to get some type of heater or other arrangement for winter. We'll go through some of these. It's actually not that hard. I always keep chickens. It's not cheap. It's probably cheaper to buy your own eggs. Depending on how you buy it, and mix for layers costs around $15, $16 for 50 pounds or more, depending on if you want GMO-free, organic, etc. And one of the hardest lessons is probably protection from predators, because everyone likes chicken, including all kinds of critters. Flying critters, digging critters, coyotes, they're weasels, there's just all kinds of critters, skunks. So fencing must be sufficient for all kinds of predators. I had a friend I was helping, and we could not figure out how she was losing her chickens, and realized, I'm trying to remember what it was, some kind of rodent, big rodent that was climbing up into a tree and then dropping in. The tree hung over the coop. And you will need housing for them, which needs to be cleaned on a regular basis. So today we're going to talk about basics for a small backyard flock, chicken behavior, chicken health, what you'll need to know, housing in terms of fencing as well, and light, protection from predators, disease concerns. And I am an egg economist by training, so I always like to keep track of the economics to make sure you're not subsidizing your buyers by charging too little if you're doing that. But chickens are fun. They're great. Kids love them. They can become very friendly. It might be a good animal to, if you want to have, your kid wants to have the 4-H experience and exhibit at the fair. But you do need to habituate them to sights and sounds. They can be very good pets if you socialize them, especially if you raise them from chicks. They are social creatures. Don't have just one. Have a few. If you do decide to have a rooster, which is really not necessary to raise eggs, they can be rough on the hens, and they can also scare kids to death. I was so frightened of roosters when I was a kid. They can be aggressive. They can be aggressive to kids. They can be hard on their hens as well. Pecking order, you've heard that before. You do have to watch when you introduce new hens, because birds of a feather flock together. They do that, and they say you can try sneaking them in at night, but oops, I don't want to go ahead that quickly. How do I go back? So what I was going to say was, you may want to stick to one breed, because bigger breeds can be hard on the younger breeds, the littler breeds that is. So they can be aggressive toward each other and establish kind of a pecking order. Okay, I think this is where we were. Foraging is a big part of their daily work. They call them tractors, chicken tractors sometimes, because they will just go out there and they'll scratch up manure. People use them to follow their cattle to eat the larvae and keep the flies down in their cattle. They're looking for food. That's their job. Sometimes if they don't have anything to do, they will start pecking on each other. And once it starts, it's very hard to control. We had that problem this year when we introduced more chickens, and I think we had just a few too many. It just really surprised me that we had that. They were pecking at each other, and we had to use these pinless peepers, which is a fantastic solution. If you don't know about these, you should, because if your chickens start pecking each other or pecking at eggs, you can order these, and it was about $12 for 40 of these little plastic units and a pair of pliers and little instructions on how to stick them on. So other jobs they do, they preen, they use dust baths, they're working on their feathers, and there's a little gland right at the base of their tail that supplies the oil that they need. It is pretty magical how warm and waterproof they stay with their feathers. And of course, they're trying to remove mites with their beaks as well. And that's another good use for diatomaceous earth. If in the wintertime, when there is no place for them to do their little dust bath, I have a kind of a plastic wash basin that I put diatomaceous earth in their coop, and that really helps them. They love it. Another problem that you have sometimes is broody hens. They stay on the eggs or chicks. Their instinct is telling them, I need to sit on these eggs in order to hatch them out. And when they're doing that, they're not laying eggs for you. You might get one or two, but then they just are doing their job. They're sitting there for 21 days or 28 days. I forget the length of time it takes. And banties tend to be very broody. Some of our more heritage fun breeds that we like to experiment with will be more broody as well. The prolactin hormone is responsible for this behavior. And the way you fix it is you put them in a wire cage with a suspended wire floor. It's very handy to have one of these anytime you need to isolate a hen for any reason. In fact, when you introduce new hens, you can put them in a cage and put them with the other chickens, but they're protected. So there's many uses to use for wire cages, but this is what I mainly use them for. There's usually a suspended wire bottom, and that cools off their butts, which is what they need, and that reduces the hormone. It takes a few days, but you can just feed and water them inside that cage for about 3 days and see if that's long enough, let them out, and usually then they're no longer in the broody mode. They do like to roost. They use perches at night and also for daytime naps. They learn to use them when they're young. Use of perches increases adult use of nests for laying. One problem we had is our chickens did not want to use our lovely nest boxes that were on the wall of the chicken house. They say if you have your perch higher than your nest box, then it will help them realize, this is where I need to perch, and this is where I need to lay my eggs. We tried all kinds of different perturbations and ended up laying our nest boxes on the floor because they simply would just lay the eggs on the floor. Now they lay them in the nest boxes, which are on the floor, and it didn't seem to matter how high we put the perches up. They just wanted to lay their eggs on the floor. Heavy strains of birds are less likely to use the perches. Straw bales may be a good substitute. They don't like wire floors. I really like to have them perch because then you have one concentrated area of droppings that you can clean up rather than having a really messy straw bale, for example. Another issue is molting, and this is a pretty extreme version of molting. It's not always that bad where they start losing their feathers. It is prompted by declining day length in the fall. It does seem to happen at different times of year sometimes, though. And it causes them to lose their flight feathers. And it does affect their laying. They are less interested in food. And getting food and water consistently every day, never letting them be without, is important to having consistent egg laying. It takes something like 21 days to make an egg, so you'll see like a 3-week delay if they have been neglected for a while. It may take them 3 weeks before they start producing for you again. Okay, so egg cannibalism. You may have seen these fake eggs. Maybe they're ceramic, maybe they're wooden, or you can even try a golf ball. But if you put a decoy in the nest, that will encourage them to learn where to put their own eggs. You don't want them laying eggs on the ground or anywhere. When they're first starting out, they don't really understand that. Some nest boxes are pretty fancy, and so the eggs will just roll out into a collecting area. But often we just make our own nest boxes, and they're not that fancy. You just collect the eggs on a regular basis. It is hard to find a suspect if you've got a chicken that starts to eat eggs, and it is very, very frustrating. You want to cull your hens, and they'll also teach others to do the same. Sometimes you almost have to start over. I am going to put links to what I think are some really good YouTubes throughout the presentation, and I have shared the presentation as well as a bunch of resources. I'll let you look at those later so we have plenty of time for questions. Again, pinless peepers work if they are attacking the eggs. Some other common health problems that the most important thing, of course, all of you that have had livestock, is to watch them. So you know what they do when they're healthy, and you notice when they start doing something different. Common health problems that you might want to watch for are diarrhea with blood. It could be coccidiosis or cannibalism. Sometimes green pasture can cause diarrhea, which is natural, but if it has blood in it, then you may need to treat them. Another problem is lameness. It could be bumblefoot with swollen hocks, and I believe antibiotics cures that. I did have a case with Marek's disease. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, and that causes lameness as well. It's very serious. Other central nervous system problems. It could just be age if it's just one hen, but if it's more than one hen or they're young, it could be vitamin E or selenium deficiency. The good thing about chickens is they really don't, they typically are very healthy and you don't have problems, but you do need to just recognize if someone is sick. Again, another YouTube link if you want to look at housing for small flocks. Allow 3 square feet per bird. We baby our birds, compared to commercial growers, and I think that's why it's fun. They're happy and you have nice eggs. Of course, you're going to need to add more room for the other things you need in there: feeder, waterer, nest box. It's good to have your water on a platform in a covered area. You want to keep it clean. Nipple drinkers are really nice, and I'll show you some of those. Rabbit-type waterers will also work. In freezing weather, you're going to need some sort of a water heater for them. And there's just lots of good supplies you can order online. They're very reasonable, that are exactly made for that purpose. Again, you need a roost of some sort. I have tried curtains on my nest boxes, and I think that they are a good idea. I did not have success with them because I was having a hard time trying to get them to go in the nest box. They like a dark area to lay their eggs. If they can't find, they will find their own, like behind a hay bale or some hidden place, if they can't find one in the areas you've provided. So you can try nest boxes with curtains. I, again, didn't have good luck with that. And it is important to have run space for daytime if you want them to be real healthy. It may need to be protected from overhead if you have hawks in your area. I've never had to do that. I don't have a lot of hens typically, and it hasn't been a problem, but it may be in your area. Here's a fancy Nestomatic galvanized nest box with a roll-out tray. You can see how the egg will roll out underneath. $39 each. So Premier One Supplies, this is one of their products, and they're very reasonable and have a lot of different options for backyard poultry production. Manure control. Chickens do produce a lot of manure. Deep litter is something people are very fond of. It's not something I use. I'll explain what I use. But it is very healthy to use shavings, preferable to straw. We have a lot of straw in this area. I just buy straw bales and I clean it out with a shovel in the old-fashioned way. But deep litter is more sanitary if you can get shavings. I've been meaning to try that next winter. And the birds do enjoy scratching, whether it's shavings or straw. The moisture gets absorbed, and that's very important. You just don't want it to get wet, and you'll notice if it smells like ammonia, it's way past time for cleaning. You need to have a healthy foot pad for the birds. And with the deep litter, you just keep adding more shavings as needed, and maybe you only need to clean it out once a year. With the straw bales that I use, I just, every time it gets very dirty under the roof, I take that out and put it in the compost, and then I'll push the less dirty straw underneath the roofs and put brand new clean straw around the food and water in the nest boxes. So I kind of make the straw do double duty, once light use and another as in an area where it gets a lot of droppings. And I have a compost bin just outside the chicken house, and I love it that way. It's very handy, and it makes really, really good garden compost. So egg storage and cleaning. Again, some of these things are from Premier One. They're very reasonable. I'm sure you can find them elsewhere. You do need to store your eggs at 55 degrees or refrigerate them. Some people do not, and you can get away with it, but it's preferable to refrigerate them. You can use fine sandpaper to clean the floor eggs if it's not coming off. I just typically, because we gather eggs a couple times a day, I wash them with warm water, and if they're very dirty, I will just use a little brush to get the dirt off. The wash water should be the same temperature as the egg. I do have eggs year-round because we put a light on a timer inside the chicken house that we use, and pretty soon we won't have to use it, but for at least half the year, you have to use it if you want to have year-round egg production. They need 14 to 16 hours of light per day. 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. works well for dark time, and an appliance timer will help you with that. If you don't have supplemental light, you may only have production for 5 months, especially as your birds get a little older. But it doesn't take a lot of light, though. It just needs to be like enough light to barely read the newspaper to do what it needs to do to encourage egg production. So here's a hanging feeder. I like to use these otherwise you're getting dirt from the floor and from their feet into the feeder. You need to use good feed. That's your biggest expense, and it's really critical to egg production and healthy birds. Starter feed for chicks should be 18% protein, and they need that for 4 to 5 months until they start laying. Laying hens need 3% calcium in their feed. I really do like to give my chickens the kitchen leftovers. You need to feed them right away, though. Don't just let it sit around at room temperature, because toxins can build up and spoil the food. But if you give them too much, and they really love things like fruit, then you'll find that they're not eating enough of their feed, and then they're not getting the minerals they need. It is critical, so don't dilute their ration with too much other material. And one of the resources that I sent earlier this morning, so I'm sure they'll be shared with you, is a extension bulletin on feeding laying hens. Another thing that you need is grit. So they need poultry grit, and they need oyster shells for calcium. I got one of these grit stations. I guess I'm doing a little bit too much advertising for Premier One supplies. Get them anywhere. It's just, I like that I put grit on one side and oyster shells on the other. I always have both available for my chickens. If you've got your chickens outside, you'll need some sort of roof over the top. If it's just in the coop, you can have it in any kind of a little container. They will tend to scratch around, though, and cover up the grit and shell, but they need it for good digestion. There's a lot of different kinds of water arrangements. There's a heated poultry water in the middle. I have more of one that looks like the quick clean waterer. You just take it out and put in a fresh gallon or two every few days. If you're just having a couple, you can use some sort of pop bottle waterer type of thing. If you have very many, you might want to try something like the system you see on the left with the little nipples, where they learn very quickly they can get their water there, and this PVC pipe arrangement that some people at WSU Pullman rigged up for their chicken tractors. We'll talk about that in a minute. Again, just keep an eye on your chickens and look for early signs of illness. It is hard to tell if you have very many of them that somebody's not eating, but do notice for dull feathers or all their markings will kind of change color. Even their eyes sometimes change color. So look for that. Stained feathers around the vent, which is there in the rear, there where the egg comes out, or on the shoulders or eyes, that means there's drainage. They tend to wipe their nasal discharge on their shoulders. Again, look for swelling, redness, or feather loss around the eyes. Crusty material in nostrils. This looks like a pretty sick chicken in the picture. Favoring or lameness in a limb. Okay, there's a seriously ill chicken. It's fluffed and huddled. Its tail is down. Decreased appetite or thirst. It may have labored or noisy respiration, weight loss. Pick them up and see if they feel light. Discharge from the eyes, nostrils, or mouth. Any kind of injury or swelling on the body. You can't really see a lot of that except for their feet. And again, bleeding. Any kind of change. So just keep an eye on your critters. You've probably heard of avian influenza. There's a lot of extension material on this topic. It's an infectious viral disease of birds that typically doesn't infect people, with some important exceptions. It does occur naturally among wild aquatic birds, and it can infect domestic poultry if they have contact with wild birds. So several cases of highly pathogenic avian influenza have been confirmed in the Pacific Central and Mississippi flyways since December of 2015. Most cases are in domestic flocks, and you can find out more information from the CDC. We are all becoming way too familiar with the CDC with the current pandemic, and we know very well that these diseases can be serious. So the symptoms are coughing, sneezing, respiratory distress, decreased egg production, swelling of the head comb and wattles around their head, sudden death. And this is the Idaho number, the 208 one. In Washington State, you'll have a different one for a state veterinarian. You can also call the USDA APHIS hotline. So that information will be in my handouts. And it reports sick or dead wild birds to Fish and Game. Again, that's an Idaho number, not helpful for you folks, but do contact your Fish and Game, and you should be able to find a local number if you see sick or dead wild birds. Marek's disease is something that is very easy to prevent by vaccination. And when you purchase chicks, they typically have been vaccinated. I like to raise my own chicks sometimes, and there was somebody, and I work as a county extension agent. Someone called in, and we had to identify what was wrong. They had birds dying. It's very contagious. It's easily transmitted in their dander. There is no cure. They get lame and sick and typically die. And it was a common disease when we had unvaccinated backyard poultry, and now it is uncommon unless they're not vaccinated. So just beware if you raise your own chicks that this could happen. You can also get them vaccinated if you are wanting to raise your own poultry. I want to really recommend this site. It is the Poultry Site Quick Disease Guide, and you can familiarize yourself with these types of things. You should just be able to Google the Poultry Site Quick Disease Guide and come up with this resource. And again, you'll have this in a handout. Protection from predators. This can be a very serious problem. A solid chicken house that is closed at night and opened in the morning if you have predator issues is your best bet. There's even automatic door openers and closers that you can install, and I think that's what that YouTube is. Uh, you may even need to, and there's some different links if you want to look at these things. You may need to even put chicken wire across the top if you've got pressure from raptors. Fencing that is tight to the ground or even extends underground is a really good idea. We tend to just keep piling up all the rocks that we have at our house around the base of our chicken house. The chickens tend to scratch there, the dog scratches from the other side, skunks, all kinds of critters that we have. So we just keep piling up all our excess rocks there. And the overhead protection is more critical for young birds. If you have a small pen, usually raptors will not feel like they can land in there and grab something and fly back out. But if you have a large pen, you may experience that kind of loss. So yeah, have it tight to the ground, and if you do start losing them from above, you may have to do that. I've never done the overhead protection. There's so many great designs. It is quite the thing these days to have your own chickens. It is very fun. There's so many designs. So this is a link to a beautiful design built by a woman and her daughter. And $20 is what she charges for the plans. You can just watch the YouTube and get an idea of what she did. But it is a very attractive backyard poultry house. Okay, chickens and dogs. Dogs will naturally chase and or eat chickens. The chickens run, the dogs chase, and that's what happens. Herding dogs will herd chickens. So you need to watch them carefully. I have been successful at teaching nearly all the dogs I've had, nearly over all the years I've had poultry, that they cannot eat my chickens. And normally I keep them apart. It has not always been without mortality. I could tell a funny story or two, but I won't do that right now. Anyway, there's a picture of a pen that extends down so that the dogs can't get in. You just need to watch them carefully, and if you can introduce your dogs to chickens when they're tiny and make them realize they can't attack them, that might help. We did that with our current border collie. But you're going to have to just be very careful because it's a natural thing. Guardian dogs can be used for protecting poultry. I have been mostly successful with this. I did have a young Pyrenees that would eat them sometimes. So again, you do have to watch carefully, and guardian dogs can sometimes not be perfect at this, but usually they will work out quite well. I really like electric poultry fencing. It is initially a little expensive, but it lasts for a really long time. It keeps the chickens in. It's portable, discourages all kinds of predators. It's easy to move. It does last a long time, and it provides about 1,600 square feet, which is nice. I don't really like moving even the chicken tractors that are mobile because you've got to take everything out. You've got to be careful that the chickens move along with it, that you don't squish anything, and it just is not that easy. So I use the electric poultry fencing and just don't move the house that often. I just move the poultry fencing around in different circles to give them fresh areas of the pasture. There's a great article on that topic there. And here's a picture showing you've got your chicken house in here. The lawn is beautiful. They must have just moved that electric fence wire to this area. And one thing we were talking about, just mentioning, is having what kind of pasture do you plant for chickens? You can use anything really. Chickens love, especially to go after the bugs and the seed heads. But they'll go after, like our cover crop. We like to use triticale and winter peas for cover crop, and the chickens love that. They will destroy it. So you have to keep moving your electric net, keep moving your chickens to new areas if you don't want them to destroy it. If you want them to destroy it, fine, but to have a nice area of grass like this, it won't stay that nice for long. So depending on the number of chickens, what kind of pasture you have, you're just going to have to keep an eye on it and start to learn how long you can leave them without doing any damage to where they're grazing. Another option that's new is plastic chicken wire. It offers some alternatives to standard wire. It's a little more rigid. You can see it has some fiberglass poles in some areas. It's going to be less expensive than investing in Electronet. But this is how I did mine as well, and I found a source with nice pictures showing how she did this. I use this for my sheep and for my poultry, and I like to have my poultry yard within my sheep pasture, and I would just keep moving it around into different areas. But as you can see, that's pretty big and heavy, and you just have to be careful that you're not running over your chickens. So you could move it when they are all out during the day. You could move it and then to a new fresh area, and then just keep moving that circle of fencing in different places. It's very easy. You just attach the net to a fence post right there, and it is not heavy. You've got all the posts gathered up in your arms with a little loop between each post. Let's see if this is obvious here. So she's just walking around the circle and dropping a post with the loop of wire that goes with it as she goes along. And then you just step the post in, and you're going to tie the last fence post to the first one to make a circle, and then you're going to need some kind of fence charger. Sometimes after if you don't have any pressure, you could do it without being charged, but I really liked it. It kept the dogs away from the chickens and the chickens in where I wanted them. This particular energizer is relatively expensive. It can be plugged in directly or to a battery and charge it that way. Every few days she has to charge it. I would just get a solar electric fence unit, which I'll show in a minute. And you can just add a post where it's sagging and use a zip tie to attach the fiberglass pole to the step-in post. This is, again, from this one supplier, but there's others. They're very helpful, though. If you want, you can talk to them, tell them what you're doing. And this is an economical one, and it easily attaches to the fence and a ground rod. You'll need a little wiring harness to connect it to. Looks like that. Okay, I want to talk briefly about economics. It is interesting for me to always find out how much it's costing me. Maybe that's not important, but if it is and you want to sell some, you need to determine your cost of production and find out if it's profitable. If you're throwing away money with each dozen that you sell, the more you sell, the more you lose, and you probably don't want to do that. So assess your market, find out if people are willing to pay quite a bit more than they pay in the store to get something that nice. I have some resources for you with a cash flow budget. We'll figure out if it is feasible, and you can also do some other things. You may want to raise broilers, for example, or something like that. But there is definitely a growing demand for local, humanely raised poultry. Widespread growth in farmers markets has given small-scale producers access to consumers interested in local products, and you can always try in a small area. I want you to observe this chicken yard. There's grass on the other side, and this is what they're going to do to that grass if they're allowed to just stay in there. They will make holes and dust baths, and it will look like the surface of the moon. Doing poultry is fun. It is what they call the gateway drug, relatively low entry costs. But you do need to know how much it's going to cost you if you want to figure out if people are willing to buy your product at that price. And I'll give you a few examples, and it is rather shocking that it is expensive to do it at a very small backyard scale. So you shouldn't be selling things for less than it costs. It will not be sustainable, and include some kind of a fair price for your labor and investment. And you can be very transparent with your customers regarding how much it costs to buy the feed. They are not expecting you to subsidize them. Feed is going to be your biggest expense. Sometimes you can buy it in bulk in half-ton bags or something, but the quality of the feed is very important. And there's ways that you can make your own, but you're going to have the base that's got all the nutrients in it. Pastured poultry feeding and management is a very technical and excellent resource if you want to look into that. Nutritional needs can be met with various combinations of ingredients. And if you can use what grows locally, but you'll need to do it with a specific recipe that they get enough nutrients. The better you feed your hens, the longer they're going to last, the better they're going to do for you. So an economic analysis places a fair market value on all factors of production. There's some, maybe you don't care about getting paid, maybe you don't care about your use of your land, but think about it, because then it is telling you, just think about the fact that you have resources involved. It is telling you if your enterprise is sustainable. And you need to think about more than just the cost of the feed. You have to think about the fact that it takes 5 months before those chicks will start laying eggs. And you've got a lot of costs and time involved up until that point. Predation losses can be very heavy, and protection from predators can be costly and difficult. So let's think about including all of your costs, and we'll have there's examples in the resources, and we'll go through quickly a little bit of that. Just back of the envelope, feed cost per dozen. A mature hen eats about 1/4 pound of layer feed per day. That might be low. I had somebody else tell me they figured 0.3 pounds of layer feed, so maybe between 0.25 and 0.3 pounds of layer feed per day. A 50-pound sack will cost at least $16. That might be a little low. So you can do your own math on this. That would be how much per pound? 32 cents. Then you do the math, and it would be 0.07, about 8 cents per mature hen per day. And if you get a dozen eggs in 13 days, which would be very good, the feed and your eggs cost $1 per dozen. I encourage you to do some simple math like this, and if you're only getting eggs in part of the year, then your feed and your eggs may cost twice that much, maybe even 3 times that much, especially if they are not laying so heavily. So keeping old hens that are hardly laying at all, it does end up getting to be expensive. And you've got your other costs, including your time. You may not want to spend all your free time gathering eggs, feeding, cleaning, delivering them to other people. So I do have an economic analysis that a friend of mine did from University of Nevada, and her analysis showed you needed to charge $6 per dozen to get 40 cents profit per bird per year in a small backyard flock setting of 15 birds. We had a presenter on a kind of a more intense, higher production, and he raises a lot of eggs on his farm. They charge $5 a dozen at a very high level, I think, with several hundred laying hens. So I think that really kind of brackets a fair price between $5 and $6, and that is a lot compared to what you get them for in the store. Most people in Boundary County charge $3 a dozen, but you're just kind of covering some of your variable costs like feed. There's lots of other costs that you're not covering. So maybe don't think about scaling up. If you're losing money at a lower level, you would just keep losing more money with more production. So what is the optimum length of time for keeping laying hens? What do you think? Well, you can see that dotted line shows that egg production kind of peaks. Oh, it looks like it's somewhere, gosh, maybe 15 weeks, 16 weeks, and then declines. So but the eggs start out small, and they get heavier with time. Where do you think would be the optimum time? Probably, I don't know, about 52 weeks. That line, I must have moved my slide a little bit, but 52 weeks, it's about a year. And I do know a lot of people that will switch out their chickens every year. They'll still lay eggs and be productive, but if you're doing it to make money, keep that in mind. You might want to sell them after a year and have new ones coming on. Okay, so you've got to figure in your chick costs, your feed costs, your waterers, feeders, brooders, so you've got to keep them warm when they're day-old chicks. That's extremely important. That their need for warmth goes down pretty quickly over a few weeks, but they will need to be like 95 degrees when you first bring them home. Again, I have some resources with details on that. You're going to have utility costs from lighting. You're going to have regular bedding costs. If you're delivering them to other people, again, think about your time. And this is a really, really nice portable chicken tractor. These things aren't cheap, so you do kind of have to think about those fixed costs that you invest in and how long they last. So here's Joel Salatin, very famous guy who teaches these topics. You can find a lot of stuff on his YouTube channel, I believe, but he will tell you, if you're not including labor, for example, you really do need to at least track your time to figure out how much is taken. I mean, you don't have to, but it's a good idea. And there is this concept of opportunity costs. If you weren't doing this, what would be the value of your next highest use for your labor? So these are kind of some economic terms you might want to think about. If you're not including all these costs, it becomes unsustainable, because when it comes time to replace the chicken house, you won't have it in your budget. If you have put in enough money to cover everything, then you should be having enough profit to take out of your savings to replace the housing. Okay, I don't know if people are interested in raising their own meat chickens, but that is a fun experiment I've done. And I did work with folks in Puyallup who were using chicken tractors on their organic vegetable production and wanted to see if they were charging enough money, and they weren't, to cover their costs. But they tried a bunch of different broiler strains. Their Cornish cross is the classic white one that typically isn't very well feathered. They have heart attacks. They're not that great for pasture production because they have been bred to have huge breasts, and their feet can't necessarily support them very well. The slow Cornish cross is a slower maturing, smaller strain, better adapted to pasture production with fewer problems, less mortality. So these are portable chicken tractors they used. You could see where they were doing daily moves across the pastures, and then they were using that to fertilize areas they were going to grow vegetables in. So we had Cornish cross, slow Cornish cross, Freedom Rangers, Kosher Kings, some other things. And the Cornish cross is the first bar, and on the left it was the weight in pounds, and on the right vertical axis is the age in weeks. So to read that, the first bar, the Cornish cross, weighed 4.7 pounds at 8 weeks. So they were ready to butcher in 8 weeks. The slow Cornish cross, and this was 4 or 5 years of data, at 11 weeks they weighed 3.5 pounds. The Freedom Rangers at 11 weeks were much bigger, 4.8 pounds. And then the, I forget what the KKs were, they were 3.8 pounds at 10 weeks. So they were pretty good. Kosher Kings. Mortality was a lot higher for the Cornish cross at 12%, but the Kosher Kings, they only tried them once because they had very high mortality, and the Freedom Rangers that are developed for this type of arrangement, 0%. Cornish cross slow had 7%. And so it's very easy to see that the feed conversion rate is much higher for the Cornish cross, which is why they're raised for this purpose commercially. It's almost 50% higher feed cost for the slow strain. If you're going to use these better adapted birds, they do take a lot longer to finish. So after a lot of careful analysis to figure out what we'd have to charge, that's the break-even price to cover all our costs. The Cornish cross, we'd have to charge $5.21 a pound, and the Cornish cross slow, $7.88 a pound. So a 4.7 pound final product, a nice big bird, would cost $24, and a 3.5 pound, the Cornish cross slow version, would be $27. So pretty hard to expect the average person to be willing to pay that. So don't do this without figuring these things out, because it is hard to charge enough. You're going to have people that really are willing to pay that much. So there's more examples of just making some kind of budget, figuring out everything. your grit, your feeder, your starting feed, the supplies, slaughter charge, $3.50 a bird, not uncommon. And then think about some of the other things you're going to be using to do this, and you're going to have to spread some of these fixed costs over several years, and I've got more detail on how to do that in the bulletin. Break-even analysis of small-scale production of pastured organic poultry that I sent in with my other resources. And if anybody has questions, they feel free to call, or email me is better. I have a spreadsheet on how to do that. So in the long run, the income from selling your product needs to cover all your production costs and satisfy your income goals. If you don't care that you make money, that's okay, but you may want to figure it out before you start to try to sell things. There's lots and lots of great resources. Backyard Poultry Magazine is one that is really nice. I have another YouTube video there. Extension.org is a wonderful resource on backyard poultry production from land-grant universities. Decide what type of poultry to raise in smaller backyard flocks is the title of this. I've got that in a number of other articles by the same Dr. Jackie Jacob. Anyway, I highly recommend that. And I took a long time to get through all those, and got a few minutes here for questions.
Kate, thank you so much.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That was a fabulous presentation, and it covered a lot of different topics. We do have several questions here. I think we have time for about 2. And again, we are keeping a recording of all of your questions. So if we don't get to them today, I will follow up with Kate and make those answers available. So one question
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
One question we had was, how do you tell which hens have retired and are not laying anymore?
I love that question because I had that for a long time and I learned how. So you take your chicken and hold it upside down and look at the vent. So the space between the legs should probably be about 4 fingers if they're actively laying eggs. And if they're not, it's going to be only like half that wide. So they will have that area where the egg comes out will have just kind of shrunk. So just observe a few and see if you can notice, okay, this is about 4 fingers wide. I think they're still laying eggs. It really looks like it's, active and wet and healthy looking back there on their vent. So just turn them upside down and just try to learn. And I bet you can find pictures online, but we did that in class. It was very, very good question.
Oh, wonderful. So, so I think we had a question about the leg rings to keep track of age.
Yeah, I haven't used leg rings. I know what some people do is they get a different kind every year. So they might have, Rhode Island Reds one year, and then the next year get the Barred Rocks or something. So they can tell the Barred Rocks are 2 years old and the others are 1 year old or 3 years old. So I know people that do it by a different breed to make it obvious. I haven't used the leg rings, and then I question myself, well, how old is that one? So very good question. It's very time consuming to go through and see who is maybe getting a free ride. So that's a good idea. I haven't tried the leg rings.
All right. Well, we do have a couple more questions, but I think to keep us on time today, we will follow up on those afterward. And Kate also provided a ton of resources. She gave those to me so I can share them with everyone and make sure that you get the links that she suggested. But Kate, thanks again so much for your time and for joining us today.